The title of my talk is The Laws of Growth of Planet Earth. And you might say, well, that's a bit much. And the only reason I have such a sort of preposterous title is mostly because half my time I spend as an astrobiologist. And so we're sort of forced in astrobiology to have, these sorts of questions. And so much of my time I spend sort of thinking about this question, which is, are there universal laws of life? That's a big question, but it's an essential question for astrobiology. So this is sort of where I'm coming from, and we've gone from this question to sort of much more detailed questions that we think are tractable, and some of those are laws of growth on planet Earth. But just to situate this, what do I mean by universal law? And what I'm talking about is the sort of thing that we have in physics, right? So the amazing triumph of physics is that we were able to take what we observed at our own planet and then our own solar system and our own galaxy and extract these laws that we expect to hold everywhere in the universe, right? So we don't expect to go to some distant part of the universe, at least for now, and find different laws of physics. And that assumption in that program has allowed us to do things like model the detailed dynamics of the sun, even though this is many overlapping physical laws and forces all at once. And it's allowed us to do truly remarkable things like detect the distant collision of two black holes with the LIGO interferometer, right? And we also have laws in chemistry, right? So chemistry is more complicated, it's more combinatorial, there's more possibilities. There's still much more for us to understand with what's happening with chemistry. But some of the basic principles allow us to do the same sort of thing. We can look across the universe, say at a distant nebula, and look at its spectrogram and understand some things about its composition, right? So this is sort of amazing. It allows us to put our whole universe in context in some way and to infer things about very distant things, which we'll need to do for astrobiology. And so my question really then is, are there universal laws of life? This is what I think about a lot. And the reason it's an important question is because typically we think about biology in this way. A vast diversity of lots and lots of different species. I'm showing here a picture of diatoms, which is a pretty narrow phylogenetic group. And I'm showing roughly one organism size. And yet even at this one taxonomically narrow part of life, and at this one size class, we see this huge diversity in morphology, right? Each of these has really different morphologies. And if we looked inside these cells, we'd see quite a diversity in physiology and composition and biochemistry as well, right? And so typically we say this is the only perspective we have on life, is this vast diversity. We have to fundamentally grapple with this amount of diversity. And that's because we'd say the only way to understand a species, trait, physiological function is through a highly interconnected and contingent evolutionary history. This is our thinking about the only way to explain one of these organisms is to know everything about what happened in its past, who it was competing against, what environment it lived in, frozen accidents, all the rest. And this is true, right? There are certain questions we can ask about organisms where this really is the only answer. And I just want to point out that this is true for some types of questions, observations, and problems, right? And there's different ways to look at life that are a bit more law-like. Right, and that looks something like this. So here we're plotting the log mass of an organism against the log biomass production rate, which is how many grams of biomass you produce per individual per unit time. And we're plotting sort of roughly across the entire tree of life, from single cell organisms all the way up to multicellular organisms. We're spanning plants and animals and insects and birds. And at this coarse-grained scale, all of life seems to fall along a single curve, right? And this sort of looks more like a physical law. Now, there's huge variation in this plot, and that's really important because this variation is where all of that wonderful diversity we were talking about lives. And it's significant variation, right? This could be a couple orders of magnitude difference. This could be the same species living in radically different environments, or this could be two very different species living in the same environment that have different evolutionary histories. And the point is that this is where all of that really wonderful diversity from life lives. But if we zoom out to the largest scale of evolution, we see these more law-like behaviors, and we have a good idea where these sorts of things come from. And so this is sort of the perspective I want you to keep in mind as we sort of go through the rest of this talk. And I just want to refine this question, are there universal laws of life, to something a little bit more tractable, which is, are there universal laws of growth, right? And the reason I'm focused on growth is that we would say a hallmark of complex adaptive systems is some ability to grow, right? It's sort of a central part of most of the systems we're interested in, right? So if we think about the simplest life, bacteria, we often think about these in terms of how do they go from one cell through a very complicated process to sort of twice their mass and then divide into parts. And this is true for sort of all the different taxa that we look at. It's a fundamental question of evolution. This is where everything with replication and selection begins, is this ability to grow and divide. We know that cities, especially recently, but even over our long human history, have gone through unbelievable amounts of growth, right? So this is one example of a Chinese city, which in less than 100 years has done this amazing growth. And we know that this is true for companies and human organizations. So this is the Ford factory floor. You can see it close to its inception in sort of this very simple form, still with the assembly line. And this is the automated assembly line of today, the machine helping us and so forth, right? So all of these systems, the ones that we would call adaptive, the ones that survive, the ones that evolve and find more complexity, they all have some sort of growth process that we're interested in. And so I just really want to introduce today whether there are simple ways to sort of unify all these systems and talk about growth in a simple way. So the two questions I'll ask are, what are the rules that govern the growth of the adaptive system? And then if we have rules, we need to ask how malleable are those rules? How much can the rules change? So I'll begin with a very simple microbial example. So this is work from the late 50s and early 60s, where this microbiologist Hurt realized that if you look at the growth of a population of microbes, and you plot, for example, the growth rate against the resource consumption rate, you see this linear relationship where as growth rate goes up, the consumption rate, and this is normalized per unit mass, also goes up. So that's nice. We have sort of linear consumption based on growth rate. But the key thing that he realized about this plot is that there's this non-zero consumption at zero growth, right? So if you're an organism that isn't growing at all, you still consume some resources. And this connected to much older ideas about what was called maintenance or repair metabolism, the idea that all organisms need to do something just to exist and survive, even if they're not growing. And this is just a way to quantify that, right? But based on this very sort of simple linear model, one can start to say simple things that all an organism is doing, in a budgetary sense, is thinking about some repair, maintenance, recycling overhead, plus some growth, production, biosynthesis. And I'm using multiple phrases here because different systems might call each of these terms different things. And in this framework, we can also say something very easy, which is, since it's linear, resources equal growth plus maintenance, right? It really couldn't be easier than this. And then if you want to understand how fast something is growing, you just need to know how much is left over after you subtract out maintenance. So growth is just the resources you have minus how much you're spending on maintenance, right? So this is a very simple perspective, but it gets more interesting if we start to think about something like this. Because a key feature of this plot, where this is really sort of quantifying metabolism and total resources, is that this is nonlinear. So the scaling exponent of this scaling law is 3/4, right? So it's significantly nonlinear. That appears for very non-trivial biophysical reasons that I don't have time to go into today. But what we can do is use this then to set one side of the budget. And now if we think of, again, resources equal growth plus maintenance, we should write down these terms in a slightly more complicated way, where we say the resources are now a power law, where we just make this a general power law of size S. And the growth is just some constant times how fast you're growing. So this would be how many resources you need to do a unit of growth, a unit of size times the rate that you're growing at. And then you have some maintenance term, which again is a cost per unit size. And this also could scale in some nonlinear way. And now if we rearrange this equation, we get that growth rates are just going to be the difference of these two power laws. And this is still a quite simple framework, but these equations lend themselves to an exceptionally rich family of functions that really allow us to capture a lot of different features. And what we're really trying to do is just understand how resources scale and how maintenance scales with the overall size of the system in order to predict growth rates. So initially, this was deployed to think about the growth in mammals. Here's a very famous paper, which is the first time this thing was deployed in mammals. And here, in the case of these organisms, the maintenance coefficient, that exponent is just 1, and alpha is this 3/4 power scaling law. And what you get out of that is asymptotic growth. Because initially, for this thing to grow at all, this term has to be bigger than that term. You have to have more resources. You have to have more investment in biosynthesis than you do in maintenance. But because this exponent is bigger than that exponent, this term always catches up to that term, and that equals this asymptotic adult size. And so you can see this does a really good job of capturing all these different organisms. Guinea pigs and guppies and hens and cows, sort of the range of a large multicellular organism. What's really cool also is that each of these constants you can measure from relationships like this. So ahead of time, you use the cross-species data to get a sense of what those parameters should be. And then you get quite a lot of predictive power out of those parameters. You just have to do a small amount of fitting to understand what's happening for each individual organism. The other nice thing is that because you have this single relationship, there's a hidden non-dimensionalization that actually unifies all these data. And to me, the sort of key result of this paper is that you can put all of the multicellular macroscopic organisms on a single growth curve. So this is a non-dimensionless time against a non-dimensionless mass. The mass is just normalized by the maximum size. The time is a little bit more complicated. There's some energetic parameters in there, but you can see how much this collapses sort of all of the data, all of that diversity onto a single growth curve, right? When I talk to physicists who might be skeptical about these scaling laws, when they see this plot, they stop being skeptical. Because to a physicist, this is sort of the thing you want, which is some sort of hidden data collapse that your model reveals. And it's sort of amazing that all of life fits into this relationship. Great. So one question would be, what creates this regularity? Why do we have these overall relationships? And that's an important question to ask. For these multicellular organisms, it's really, and this is the work of West, Brown, and Inquist, it's really about these three-dimensional vascular networks that need to feed all the individual cells. And then you just optimize those for transport, and amazingly, you predict 3 corridors. But because that's based on biophysics, we should expect that relationship to change a little bit when you go to small scales, right? Because small organisms don't have these vascular systems. They're obeying different physics. And indeed, when you zoom in on the smallest scale of life, you see distinctly different scaling relationships. And we have some recent work showing exactly how the physics are shifting across these taxonomic groups. So these are the first 3 major evolutionary transitions after an origin of life, going from bacteria to unicellular eukaryotes, small multicellular organisms. And as you go across each of those transitions, the scaling exponent between, again, we should just think about this as total resources, but the total energy available to cells against their size distinctly shifts across these regimes. What that means is that this term in this equation is different for each of these categories of organisms. We should expect really different growth dynamics. Just to make that clear, if this, again, for beta equals 1, which we should mostly assume for this talk, if alpha is greater than 1, then this term is always faster than that term. And these things are constantly accelerating in their growth rate, and you get curves that look like this, and actually have a finite time where the whole thing goes off to infinity. What physicists would call a finite time singularity. If alpha is less than 1, we have the case I explained before, where this term gets beat by that term, and you have this asymptotic growth where organisms reach some fixed maximum size, an adult size, and they don't grow past that. So we can now test this because we know these different organisms have different types of growth. And indeed, what we see is that if you look at the bacteria where alpha is greater than 1, you have these constantly accelerating curves. And the way that bacteria manage that is that they grow only over a factor of 2. Right, so at some point out here, growth rate becomes too fast for them, goes off to infinity. That's okay because they just want to double in size and halve. And so they sort of avoid that problem. And this is a really nice growth form for them. So the sort of first rule I want you to take away from all of this is you have non-trivial combinations of fundamental constraints. Those lead to scaling exponents. Those scaling exponents then predict these growth forms. And then when you see shifts in these constraints, you should also see shifts in the growth, right? So this is sort of, in a very broad sense, exceptions proving the rule, right? Where you go from bacterial growth with exponents greater than 1 to multicellular growth with exponents less than 1, and we see these really different types of growth dynamics. So this is a general thing to look for, and it really tells us to focus on this resource exponent. In any system, we really want to know how the key limiting resource is scaling with the size of the system. I want to mention that this has worked really well for predicting cities. This is other work. This is work led by Louise Betancourt and Jeffrey West, where they noticed that if you look at the population size of a city against its total wages, you have a superlinear exponent. If you thought wages were something like the key resource, and there's debate about whether that's a key resource, then you should expect these curves to have this going off to infinity problem. And indeed, they spend a lot of time describing that, where you have curves running off to infinity, and then they propose that you have to do some sort of innovation or transformation in the city to get on a different curve, and you just keep doing that over and over again. But this is important because these are systems we care about. These are systems we care about forecasting in the future, and they do have this sort of superlinear growth in resources with increasing size. That makes up this. The other thing to think about that I haven't been so careful about yet is that these exponents could be changing in time systematically, say as the systems evolve. So early in life, for example, we don't expect organisms to be fully optimized according to these physical constraints. So maybe this resource scaling changes in time. And we actually see that for cities. So this is what theory predicts should be the sort of steady state optimal exponent for cities, which is the one that we we're basically showing on the previous slide. And you can see that as cities age, they're approaching this exponent and then hitting some steady state exponent, right? And that means that the growth dynamics in this equation are actually time dependent, right? That cities, until you get to this point, are not following a single growth law. They're actually following a much more complicated growth law where the exponent is changing, and then mature cities will follow the growth laws that we've been talking about. So this is a really sort of key subtlety to take away from this sort of perspective. But we can also use that. So here's a case where we said, let's think about where we might project electrical vehicles going in the future. This is, in each curve, the scaling for gasoline vehicles and sort of the current steady state system. This is vehicle registrations as a function of population. This is the number of gas stations or electrical vehicle charging stations, which we'll talk about in a second, as a function of population. And these, you can notice for vehicle registrations, this is just linear scaling. And then for gasoline stations, this is sublinear scaling because you get this economy of scale and infrastructure that there's a lot of theory about. And then if we look at electric vehicle chargers or electric vehicles and their chargers, both of those look very like they have very different scaling, right? So very superlinear scaling in the number of vehicle registrations with increasing population, and then this linear scaling in the number of chargers, right? But we would say electrical vehicles are likely doing something like this. It's a new technology entering the market. It should be way out of equilibrium. So we should expect something like this to happen. And the thing we should expect then is for electric vehicles to eventually saturate to the scaling curves that we have already seen for gasoline vehicles, because there's not really a deep fundamental difference there. And so this allows us to make a prediction that if this curve approaches this curve with some population growth in the background, and this curve approaches that curve, that tells us what should happen to electric vehicles. And what you see is that at this small end, at low population, you're much farther away from the eventual equilibrium curve than you are at large end, where these are relatively close. And so we should expect unpopulated areas to have the biggest growth in electric vehicles. And the same is true for chargers, right? Where the unpopulated areas need more chargers. The populated areas, some of them, like these 2 points, might actually already be in equilibrium of what we expect, right? So really dense cities may already have enough, roughly have enough chargers. We should expect growth in the unpopulated regions. And so we turn that into a map to sort of give people a way to forecast or to baseline expectations for electric vehicles. And now this is showing county by county the sort of relative expected increase in electric vehicle chargers, where down here is basically no change, and then here is quite a lot of change. And so you can see that the country is incredibly heterogeneous. There are regions like coastal California where you might be sort of close to equilibrium. And then in different parts of the middle of the country, for example, New Mexico, you have some counties like Santa Fe, which is this county here, that look like they're closer to having the right number of chargers. And then you have southern counties in New Mexico that look more out of equilibrium. And this might even be, we might even say this is more far away from the eventual steady state, given that there are close running freeways here that are quite used. And so people are actually using this as a transit line. That's not in our calculation because we're only using the local population. But this does give us a roadmap for sort of where you can expect there to be a lot more chargers built and a lot more vehicle registrations to occur. So the second rule I want you to remember is just that during the early evolution of technologies or any system, expecting the resource exponents to change and to initially be out of equilibrium and then find some eventual balance, right? And if you don't account for that, you could have the wrong growth model. But I think there's a systematic way to do this by having some reference case like we did in the electric vehicle. Okay, so far we've talked about cells, we've talked about cities to some extent, and a little bit with technologies. And I want to turn our attention now to a little bit more in-depth perspective on companies and how they grow. I think this is general to human organizations and how we might think about them. And so I really want to just focus on thinking about old companies like Coca-Cola and John Deere, and we can ask questions about what does their long growth trajectory look like. And here too, there are very old questions. This is Gebrat's law, which originally he called the law of proportional effect. This is the original French cover page. And what Gebrat said was growth rate should just be some constant times the size of the system. So what he's really saying is the specific growth rate is constant for all these different systems. And that's really what he means by proportional effect, is that if you normalize by size, you're just getting a constant. But in our framework, we would have a lot of questions about this particular form, right? Because we've already said we expect growth to be some nonlinear term for the production minus some other nonlinear term for the maintenance. And so this automatically sort of gave us a sort of window on skepticism for Gebrat's law, which has been questioned broadly in the economic community, but with maybe a little bit more traction in the specifics. So what we need to do to understand that is to look at the scaling relationships. So this is breaking down companies in terms of their main budgetary aspects and thinking about their scaling. In each of these plots, you'll see the US in this darker color and China in this lighter color. We'll return to talking about China at the end. But this is, for example, how liabilities, sales, net income, and cost of sales expenses all scale with the total assets of a company. We think total assets is the right size measure for complicated reasons that we can discuss offline. But what's nice is that in each of these key budgetary items, if you look at how they scale with total assets, you get pretty well-behaved scaling relationships. And you can see that those scaling relationships vary for different features of this budget, from things that are linear to things that are significantly sublinear. So taking a perspective like this, which we typically have for companies, we have all of these different financial flows. What we can isolate is that the main way that you'd expect the assets to change, again, assets are the size measure, is income plus the rate of change in liabilities, right? So this is basically, minus expenses, how much you're bringing in, and then you have this rate of change in things like debt. And for each of these two terms, we know that both of these two terms are based on assets via these scaling relationships. So now we can write down the rate of asset change as this scaling relationship with these sort of two different exponents. This is the exponent for income, and this is the exponent for liabilities with assets. One of these is really close to 1 in this case. So you can see in the US system, all right, I should go back. In the US system, liabilities are very close to 1. And so in this equation, if this term is very close to 1, we can basically ignore it. And we get this really nice closed form relationship for assets that only depends on different constants of this model and the scaling of income. And this looks a bit more complicated than it actually is. What we really say is that assets grow like time to the 6th power. right? Which is not something people had recognized about companies before. And we'd say that on average, looking across the whole market, you should expect assets to go like T to the 6. And that works really well if we look at total assets against the time since a company has entered the market. Huge amounts of variation. We'll come back to talk about that. And then you have this sort of P to the 6 riding over the top. This is that same plot in log space, just because that's the easiest place to see this, sorry, log linear space, easiest way to see this time to the 6, which works really well for the market average above a certain size. And you might be saying, time to the 6 sounds unreasonably fast, and it is very fast, but it's still slower than an exponential. So all power laws are slower than an exponential. And what that means is that if we plot the best fit sort of late stage market growth exponential over the top of this, we see that T to the 6 beats it at early times and then is overtaken by an exponential for late time, right? So early companies are growing much faster than the market, and then late stage companies start to grow slower than the market, right? As you get big and old, you're actually having problems with the overall market. And just to highlight a few things on this plot, this green curve is Apple. So this is an unreasonable positive outlier, and you can see how exceptional this growth has been. This negative curve here in gray is a poor plastics company that we decided to pick on. As you can see, they grow a little bit at the end, which is strange, but up to that point, they never grow, they never realize a profit. They enter the market and just sort of start continuously dying. And then this blue curve is Coca-Cola, right? It's one of our most typical or common companies. It grows basically like the market average. Warren Buffett is right about if you want to have reliable growth, pick a big company that you know has a good long-term market average and invest it in it and hold it for 40 years. Coca-Cola is one of his favorite companies, and he's right. If you pick Coca-Cola and you just hold it, you will grow like this T to the 6 over long periods of time in the market, which is really interesting. So this again says that the draft law is not correct, but we should show this a little bit more explicitly because it's there's a lot of sort of implications or inferences about this curve. And we can do that by just looking at the growth rate against total assets. Again, because of these equations we have, we expect this to have a non-constant dependence in this space, which we can predict from the exponents. And this is then what growth rate looks like against assets. So you can see it's decreasing. The specific growth of companies is decreasing in time, which is characteristic of those curves that we just looked at. Okay, but something you might have noticed looking at these plots, if you're paying really close attention, is that China is not growing in the same way as the US. It doesn't have the same scaling relationship. So, for example, Chinese liability in publicly traded companies has this superlinear exponent, which, as we saw with the cities and the bacteria, we should expect that to have huge consequences. And it has the superlinear exponent in liability against assets, but it has basically the same net income scaling, the same sales scaling, and roughly the same cost scaling, although the cost scale's slightly higher. And so if we take this on board, and now we say, we can't just say the liability exponent is close to 1. We can't make this approximation. We get a more complicated growth form and a different style of growth in the Chinese market. Now, this market is smaller. We have less companies, but you can see now that I don't have this T to the 6. In fact, I have something that is accelerating towards the end. And that acceleration is, again, because the liability exponent is superlinear, right? So we would say that at present, the Chinese market sort of has this singularity it's headed off toward. It should have this accelerated growth for the largest companies. That probably isn't achievable in the same way it wasn't for bacteria. They have to do something as they start to approach that. But it does say that for this younger market with a much smaller average size company, the way that that whole system is dealing with liabilities is leading to this really interesting growth dynamic. And this brings me to my third rule, which is societal structure, policy, and norms can shift these exponents. I don't think this is true for biology, by the way. But in the biological cases, we know these exponents come from really basic physical constraints. But here we're already, in the social system, we're already seeing that the US and China have really different takes on debt. And that debt is driving really different growth dynamics. Now, you could ask where that comes from. Is it just in the US? People know that you have this fast early growth, and so people are willing to give more liabilities to small companies to get a hold of this fast growth. You could argue that maybe in China, there's more of a system-wide sense that you want to grow the biggest companies in this market can reach the same size as the US market. There's all sorts of interesting things to unpack. But the point is that at present, these liability exponents are different. We don't quite know why, but something about the choices these countries are making are affecting their. And so that's really interesting. The other thing that we really took away from this is that debt looked to us entirely different than anything that we'd seen in biology. And we spent a long time trying to think of a debt analogy in biological systems. If anyone has one, please come talk to me afterwards. We thought, well, maybe feeding young in gestation is sort of a certain sort of debt, right? That a mother gives to their own genome one generation later by gestating it young and then feeding it when it can't feed itself, and that's really investing in its own genome delayed in some time. But it's sort of one genome playing these time delay games, and so it's not really quite debt. What's interesting about debt is that I can grow now and I have to pay you back in the future, and we may not even know each other, right? We're just part of some larger system. It seems like a really unique thing to the human world is this ability to have debt, which is exciting. I want to highlight that for this project, which is really new work, this came from a really exceptional team of people. And those people span physicists like Jake, Jeffrey, and myself, to anthropologists like Marcus, and two economists in Veronica and Ruyi. And it really took all of us sort of thinking about this in different ways to get at this work. This team, we continue to work on a bunch of things together, and it's just a really fantastically fun collaboration. I just really want to point to all of them because everything that is in this paper really required essentially one of these people to be involved in. And I think that's important for these interdisciplinary projects. I want to end in talking a little bit about how we can take these beyond just growth of single entities, right? It's certainly a critique you have at this point. It's nice to know how companies grow. It's nice to know how organisms grow. But what if we're interested in bigger problems? And some of those bigger problems are problems of ecology, right? So we can think about how an elephant grows, but an elephant is really coupled to this environment where here you can see it's knocked over one of these trees, which elephants like to do, and is eating the leaves. It will also eat grasses, but there's this complicated relationship between an elephant and its resources. And one of our questions was, could we start to use this framework to build up different sorts of ecological models? And so we said, sure, we sort of understand resource dynamics for organisms. You have full individuals, you have hungry individuals, you have some coupled resource, and full individuals, when they're happy, can give rise to offspring. Those offspring then grow up to be a full individual if everything goes well. These full individuals can also, all of these states consume resources. These full individuals can also starve to some hungry state. That hungry state doesn't give rise to offspring because there just aren't the resources. If life gets better in the hungry state, it can go back to being full, it can sort of recover. And if life doesn't get better in the hungry state, of course, it will die. And all of these transitions and existences require resource consumption at some rate. So this is sort of focusing on these two different states is not so common, but this is a typical sort of demographic or population scale ecological model. But what we can bring to this is this realization that we have these hidden growth laws in the background. And these growth laws can help us calculate all of the costs and transitions in a model like this. So for example, to go from newborn to full, we just have to trace out this curve along our growth trajectory. We can integrate how many resources it takes to make that transition, and then we understand the time it takes to make that transition. You can do the same thing for how long it takes to starve, how long it takes to go from starving to dying, and then if you recover, what that sort of growth curve looks like. All of this we can root in one of these scaled growth curves in very simple bioenergetics of these organisms. And when we do that, these are the equations, not so important. When we do that, we start to predict things like how starvation rates and recovery rates affect whether you have a cycling steady state or a single fixed point steady state. And then what the overall population abundances are as a function of these parameters. But of course, as I just said, these parameters are not arbitrary. They're determined by body size. And so we can situate known mammals in this sort of overall phase space of things like recovery rates and starvation rates. This is a 100-gram mammal, so think a mouse. This is a 1,000,000-gram mammal, so think elephants. And you can see that in each of these points, you have this probability of extinction, which is really based on the instabilities of this space and the low population densities of this space. And the mammals that we see evolved sort of sit in this valley of low extinction probability, right? So mammals are really trying to get away through the long evolution of their parameters from these high extinction regimes. And we thought that was really exciting. But because we know how these parameters change explicitly with body size, we can also do things like predict the steady state abundance as a function of body mass. The green curve here is the full individuals. The orange curve is the starving individuals. We see that there aren't so many starving individuals, which makes sense. When you look at a natural population of deers, you don't see so many deers that are emaciated and about to die. But most impressively is that hungry individuals sort of follow the known scaling relationship that was just empirically known between mammalian population density and body size. This is called Davis law. It's called a law because he compiled 1,000 references. So if you write a paper with 1,000 references, I think you get a law named after you. And so we predict this scaling, but then we also predict this cool thing that happens, which is you reach this very large mammal size, the resources crash out. So the steady state resource abundance goes to 0. You can see the starving individuals explode and the hungry individuals crash. So there's sort of this asymptotic size at the large end of mammals. And that allows us to predict the largest possible mammal size. So this is our prediction for where this asymptote is. We say this is the largest that mammals should be. And these are the 2 largest mammals known in the fossil record, right? So they're a little bit smaller than our upper bound, but in pretty good agreement. If you do a secondary analysis where you say, where in this dynamics could you have an invader invade smaller body sizes, you find out that these are really close to the optimal body size. So here's our prediction for the optimal body size. These are these 2 largest mammals. And just to give you a sense of what they look like, this is Intracytheria. It's about 4 times an elephant. It has this really strange morphology. It's sort of an elephant and a giraffe have this really large offspring. And so we're doing a good job of sort of capturing the biggest things we expect to have seen in the past. So because we can predict population abundances and paleoecology, we think this model is doing a really nice job of sort of leading us through the things we care about over biological times. We also, in a second paper, injected sort of noise into this model to think about these growth trajectories in a stochastic sense. And when you do that, you can predict exactly what the evolutionary trajectory should look like. Whereas a function of resource clustering, which is some temporal measure of variability, you can predict what the optimal body size is in this space. This is the optimal body mass, and you can predict what the selection coefficient is, which is the overall color. And then these are different lineages of mammals. So suids, which are pigs, equids, which are horses, rhinos, and then these big things like elephants and Intracytheria. And we show that these are sort of following our gradient for selective pressure as the world becomes more homogeneous, which is what happens as grasslands evolve. We expect organisms to get much bigger. And indeed, that's what happened over the long lineage of these different mammals. All of this, again, is really based on just a simple idea of using size as a way to predict all of these transition parameters. And we build up to things like current mammal populations and these long arcs of life. I'll just mention quickly, we did the same thing for trees. So the main thing about trees is that they don't move around. So that's what the sessile part of this paper is. And the same sort of general framework works for trees, where we can predict their overall abundance as a function of size. So this is counting up all the individuals in one forest. And then you can also extend this to termite mound systems and their packing on the landscape and coral reefs and so forth. Where again, the key idea is just really the simple connection between body size and all of these different transition parameters in some demographic model. So I think what we're starting to see is a nice sort of way to get at these systems we really care about, systems that evolve and adapt, using a very simple concept about how fast your resources grow in the size of the system. Growing size is what growth is all about, and how maintenance also changes. I think our sort of 3 simple rules about that are, just to remind you, look for the resource scaling first. Don't expect that to be constant if your system is new or recently evolved. And for social systems, expect those exponents maybe to change quite a lot based on what city, country, society, set of social norms you live within. So I actually think our growth laws, the framework is nice, but the specific exponents are probably the most flexible in human social system. That's something to really pay attention to. My sort of higher takeaway from that is, I think this framework of using resources and maintenance is exceptionally general, and I really advocate for applying to lots of different systems. And I think if we can build all the way up to sort of what we consider ecologies. We've mostly done those ecologies for mammals and the history of mammals, but you could also think about ecologies of companies and ecologies of cities. That work is much newer and not out yet. I'll leave you with one final sort of meta point, which is sort of about doing science and how I think different communities need to talk to each other. So this is a paper we wrote aimed mostly at biosphere sciences. And what we argue in this paper is that we think there's sort of 3 cultures operating in the complex systems world, especially in the biosciences. And we call those variance culture, which is really looking out at the world and seeing all the different things that exist. This is documenting all that wonderful biological diversity. Exactitude culture, which we would say is trying to model each of those individual species that have been observed, put those into some big model. And this sort of coarse-grained culture, which is trying to find these compact sort of general model that we described. And we sort of mentioned that these 3 groups each have huge strengths and weaknesses, and they don't often talk to each other very much. But where things get really good is when, for example, variance culture overlaps with coarse-grained culture. I'd say that's where these scaling relationships I was talking about come from. We relied on the vast number of species, observations, and measurements to build these coarse-grained models, right? So that's sort of the positive. But where this can go wrong is when physicists build a coarse-grained model that's totally out of contact with the known and measured variation. We've all seen that happen a million times. And so that's sort of the pitfall of this connection. A positive, for example, of coarse-grained culture and exactitude cultures where people build, giant intricate simulations, for example, of the Earth system, but they build those up based on simple physical laws and regularities, and then add a bunch of layered details on top of that, right? So I'll leave the paper to sort of untangle all the pros and cons of combinations, but our argument is that each of these has a strength for different types of problems, and it's really the integration across these 3 cultures that'll help us make progress. We said for the biosphere, but I think this applies just as well for theoretical social sciences, theoretical economics, and also the long history of evolution and ecology. So with that, I'd like to acknowledge a few funding sources. The main contributors to the newest work I listed before. The other contributors to all the other work are sort of embedded in all the different papers I showed. And I'd be happy to have some questions and discussions. I think sort of to make fun of myself, I'm just over and over again trying to make really bad Kandinskys. So these are 2 really terrible Kandinskys. This is a really wonderful Kandinsky. And thank you for your time.
So if I was following correctly, we're talking about the growth of assets of companies over time. Is my interpretation correct that some of that growth is just from inflation?
So the question was, the growth of assets, is some of that just from inflation? I should have mentioned that all of those scaling plots and the growth curves are after adjusting for inflation. So we already use the inflationary model to normalize all that data and then look at the growth on top of that. You could leave inflation as a term, and then some of the constants in front of the exponents would be changing in time. And so you'd have a slightly different growth curve. But this is sort of, economists are often looking at these normalized growth trajectories to understand performance independent of the inflation. But that's a very important thing, is that we normalize the data by inflation first. Great question.
So your liabilities versus assets, China-US differences. The difference between equity startups versus debt startups. So equity finance startups won't have the debt side. They'll still have the same amount of assets.
Yeah, so something I haven't mentioned here also is that we're looking at publicly traded companies. So we're looking at things that are well past IPO. We're looking right now at private companies, and they have slightly different growth dynamics, and there's more things to think about there. And then there's also a whole bunch of things in those growth dynamics that you could think of as correction terms that do make the model a little bit more accurate, like including dividends, for example, which some companies pay quite a lot of, will affect, how dividends scale with size will affect those curves. That turns out to be a small effect, but it's something that we include in the supplement for completeness.
How do you think about failure in the curve, right? Most companies actually fail. Like these are the winners that are selected. And I assume it's the same even on animals, right? Most babies who are born don't make it to a mature adulthood.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question was, how do we think about failure? And so there's a bunch of interesting mysteries there. So Thibault Wibbins has some really nice work showing that the median company in the US is actually not profitable, right? Which is a weird thing. So it means that, most of economic growth is happening on a minority of the companies, which is interesting. As you saw, many of those trajectories are going very strongly negative. And it's not like all the companies are clustered around our curve with some variations. Like the variation is really intense. Like things seem to bifurcate in these two directions. We're trying to understand that. We're trying to understand, is that good or bad? So in evolutionary dynamics, there are really well-formed notions about what's the maximum rate of mutation you want to have. And there are limits on that mutation rate, and there's sort of optimals about what mutation rate will lead you to the most adaptation. That comes with a lot of depth. That comes with, every mutation that's the wrong choice comes with an extinction of a species. But there we have a sense of what the right mutation is. I don't know if we know that yet for economic systems, either in terms of what's being optimized, what the best search algorithm is, how should you set that variance to maybe discover new things versus have regular market growth that increases the overall market average. They're really interesting questions and all of that we haven't even started to unpack. But yeah, I think it's exactly the right question.
Kind of interested in the outliers on the companies, like things like all the questions about the companies, right? But especially the negative outliers. And if you have a sense of like a plastics company, would Enron look like that? Is there anything in common between those negative outliers?
Yeah, so there is some correlation between, we broke that down by industry as well in that paper. And there is some correlation between industry and the perfection of negative and positive outliers, and even some of the scaling exponents, which is another way of saying positive negative outliers relative to the whole market. And so it does look like there are certain industries where it's much easier to go negative. Or said another way, there are industries where those exceptional positive, insane trajectories like Apple are sort of impossible, right? Industries with a huge amount of material, facilities or equipment that they have to build up and buy, it's really hard to have some of those positive trajectories. Now, Apple solved that problem in complicated, interesting ways, but we don't see so much mining or physical goods production companies don't also have a software component or et cetera, in those sorts of curves. So that's part of the answer, but we're still trying to understand all that variation.
Malfeasance be kind of a common.
Yeah, and the Enron question is really interesting. Like, yeah, could we use this to detect fraud?
Yeah.
Throws back. Yeah. And I don't. We've talked about that some. I don't think we have a good answer there yet. Because what would you say about Apple? The funny thing about Enron was, there are all these articles written about what was so special about Enron, right? There's like all this marketing advice, all this business advice about why they're such a special company and the rules they deploy internally and how everyone should copy that. And then a month after those articles written, it all turns out just to be an accounting fraud thing, right? But all the losses to some portion of the companies. I don't know yet if we have a detection method for that. I think you could use something like this for detection of fraud. Or the positive outliers may always fool you, but there are at least ones to look at more closely.
I was curious, great talk, by the way. I was curious if, like in the biological sense, when there are these transitions between different efficiencies in terms of consumption of metabolic rate and everything like that. I don't know how far back you went with these things, but if you went back before, say, the Industrial Revolution, would you see like transitions there as well in terms of some of these scaling plots?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would love to think about that both in the biological and the company sense.
Yeah.
Companies, we have really good data sort of on the publicly traded US companies post 1950. There are deeper time analyses. It's just not, there's not as many companies, not as regular. We really love to look at that, like all the way back to the Industrial Revolution. Haven't done it yet. And then I think the same question you could ask about early cells. And I wonder this quite a lot. Were the early cells really suboptimal? How suboptimal? Did they have a different scaling law? What can we say about any of that? I will say that a lot of the variation in bacteria, for example, there are sort of hidden normalizations there. So some metabolic pathways are more efficient than other metabolic pathways. If you normalize by that, you collapse the scatter sum, and there's all sorts of games when like there. Who's living in a high pH environment, and because those data are actually taken across a lot of different conditions, and so there's ways to normalize some of that to reduce the scatter. But that is a certain sort of efficiency. Some of that efficiency, by the way, is a frozen accident. Like sometimes we just discover an enzyme, and that's the enzyme we have for a metabolic pathway. It's hard to discover enzymes, and so whether that thing is ultimately efficient is. We can tell sort of the energetics of the reaction, and often they're not. Other enzymes we can tell are really, really very close to the best that you could do thermodynamically with the reaction. Or energy, the best you can do energetically. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Very intriguing. I'm wondering if implicit in this analysis is the kind of some isomorphism in dynamics of firms, and whether that falls, right? So do we have some companies that are more like bacteria? But more seriously, we think about these systems. Will monopolies behave in the same way as ordinary firms? Have you looked into that?
It's a great question. So the question was, are there some firms that look more like bacteria in terms of their superlinear growth? Are there other firms that might, how do monopolies affect the system? I think monopolies are growing, things that are headed towards monopoly is really interesting. We haven't broken that out. There's an interesting sort of dynamic there also that as you become a monopoly, you also probably are starting to feel more of the total resources that are out there, right? So if you're an early company growing, those early companies don't feel the total size of the market that could be had yet, because they're selling a small amount. But as you become a giant in the market, you may start to see, if you're a monopoly for a certain product, you start to see what the total sales of that product look like. And then you might be paired to how fast population is growing in the background, right? So monopolies might also have this thing where they start to slow down even more because the only thing that's driving growth is how fast people are growing, unless they're inventing new products. Now, companies that have tons of products and are inventing tons of products or sell lots of other people's products, their monopoly might have a different growth dynamic. But I think that's a really interesting question in flat space to explore. The other thing about companies that we thought was really interesting is that they're what we would call in biology an indeterminate grower. So the market's catching up with them, which might make them more likely to die. But that T to the 6 has no asymptote. So that T to the 6 just keeps growing. And we don't see any sort of evidence there that they're starting to sense a finite thing or finite size effect or starting to reach an asymptotic size. Mammals, we all reach asymptotic size, right? Many fish seem to be indeterminate growers. Lobsters are. So there are some aquatic things that look like they have this indeterminate growth. So that's sort of similar with biology, but certainly not in this T to the 6 way. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you very much. It's very interesting. Just maybe I wanted to get your opinion on sort of the limits of predictive models that you're trying to build, right? Because I find it very fascinating and I don't know. You study biology, right? And you transfer those concepts to social systems. You already discussed that concept that is not very good to imagine. So what is the ultimate goal of the models that you're building? Where their predictive power sort of stops?
Yeah, so I think so the question is, where does the predictive power stop? And I think there's two answers to that you're highlighting already in your question. One is, where do the analogies break down? Right, so if ahead of time, could we have said anything about companies before we learned all this cool stuff about death, right? Could we have said, no, if we thought of companies as some transition in the history of life, So we've said the next thing that we're going to invent in life is debt. And that debt will, determine have different growth dynamics and sort of expected all that ahead of time. So far not, right? It'd be really impressive if we could say, what's the next evolutionary transition and what new thing will be there like debt? We don't have good answers to that. So I think in terms of the conceptual predictive power, I think we are a bit blind, right, in terms of predicting these totally new things like debt. There's a different sort of predictive limitation, which is that all the models I've shown are really good at predicting averages, right? So predicting market average, predicting the average mammal, writing down ecological models where we're averaging over lots of species, or we're trying to predict some macro perspective. If you want to understand those outliers, our model is most useful for removing the average and then getting a fair comparison of what the outliers look like, right? So often we talk about these laws as a way to remove what I call the boring bit, right? Which is the average bit, the sort of expected bit, the law-like bit. And then you can get at the interesting questions about diversity, overperformance, underperformance, choices companies made to achieve one or the other, the same for individual species. What's so unique about some of the cacti that we see in New Mexico? The scaling laws help us understand what's unique about them. And so I think in some ways it's a way to sort of remove out some pieces for certain questions to then ask more interesting questions about the diversity. But that's certainly a predictive one. In other cases, we're finding that even some of that variation are just higher order terms we keep adding to the theory. And that looks more like systematizing lots of laws in physics. But there's a whole conceptual metaspace that you and I should talk about some of that. Yeah.
So failure responses questions. I don't think about it. But I wanted to understand, can you maybe map certain policies to or like certain policies that say governments apply to like the environment of organisms that like let them attain a certain growth rate, and like have you thought about it? Is that something that's possible?
Yeah, it's a great question. The question was, can we think about policies as certain sorts of environments for companies or other organizations to grow up in? Yes. And so we think about those mostly as the different sets of constraints that the organization is evolving under. So for us in our sort of framework, a change in policy would be like shifting the law of gravity a little bit or something like that. And so it's more the constraints that a whole system is evolving under. We looked at universities in a scaled way, which I didn't show. Interesting thing about universities is that each of the different broad categories in the US, community colleges, private public research universities, and we looked at liberal arts colleges, all the rest, all of them have different scaling relationships. And we could interpret those scaling relationships in terms of the types of mission statements they have. Right. So for example, community colleges have a strong mission about providing value to the student and educating people at a low cost. All these universities are realizing economies of scale. It looks like community colleges actually to redeploy that economy of scale to bring tuition down. Other schools use that economy of scale to increase prestige, pay faculty more, and boost the research enterprise while also paying faculty more, right? Which is part of that whole thing. Oh, sorry, while also charging the student more for tuition. So those are, to our mind, those look like mission statement constraints that these different categories of universities are operating under with really different scaling relationships as a consequence. Yeah.
So I was thinking more of like mapping it to like, back to biological concept, like say pH level change.
Which change?
So like pH level change.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think one could do that to sort of make a pH or metabolic pathway analogy. And there I wouldn't be surprised if some of the scatter we see is correlated with some set of policies we haven't looked at yet. Haven't done any of that, but I think that would be the hypothesis that you would go looking for is, can we interpret the scatter in terms of policy differences? Yeah, internal or external. Yeah, great question. Okay, well, I think that's my time. Thank you so much.